last lesson, we learned how the new middle class wanted to be respected by the public during the Victorian era, and used techniques like etiquette to show their respectability. Today we will look at how the women during this time period emerged from their silent lives to develop a voice in the public light. During this time period, it was improper for women to speak up in a public setting, especially when men were around. This had to do with the ideology of separate spheres. In this ideology, men were seen superior to the public in the public life when it came to economics, commerce, and politics. Women, on the other hand, were confined to the private sphere, where they tended to children, housekeeping, and religious education. Their main purpose was to be a good wife, mother, and housekeeper. The suffrage movement took off because a few outspoken women decided to voice their opinion, most notably Emmeline Pankhurst. She was a leading suffragist and president of the Women's Social and Political Union, known as the WSPU. After years of conservative demonstrations, Pankhurst and other radical suffragists began using aggressive tactics, such as smashing windows and burning buildings. When women began to be imprisoned, they continued protesting by refusing to eat or drink in the prisons. This led to police officials to force-feed the suffragists. Pankhurst justified the tactics, saying they were necessary to achieve victory. It wasn't until 1918 until women over the age of 30 could vote, and it wasn't until an entire decade after that until all women could vote. When looking at the beginning of the women's movement in the United States, we can start by looking at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony joined together to bring awareness to women's rights, anti-slavery, and the temperance movement in the 19th century. This movement coincided along with the abolition movement in America. During the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, many abolitionists were women who were also fighting for suffrage. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, outlawing slavery. 3 years later, the 14th Amendment was passed, giving citizenship to all born in the U.S. However, women still were not necessarily included. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to men, mainly African Americans. It wasn't until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, to give all women the right to vote in the United States. When looking at the changes in education in the Victorian era, one would have to look at the leadership of Prime Minister William Gladstone. In the late 1800s to the early 1900s, social reforms were emerging, directed towards the working class. Remember, the middle class were now workers who profited and owned property. The working class were poor and below the middle class when it came to the social status. William Gladstone called for an Education Act for free elementary education for all children. Now this was seen at first like a great idea, which it was, but women were still being educated to become better wives and have proper etiquette. Eventually, schools were developed specifically for specific trades in women's education, like universities, trade schools, and women's colleges.